So I'm just going to minimize my toolbar, and as I say, we're going to be looking at the purchase ledger. Now, the purchase ledger module everybody uses, and they'll be using it on a day-by-day basis. But for a lot of you, the system would have been set up quite a while ago, and there's lots of other options available to you that maybe you're unaware of, or you're unsure of what the actual implications are. So we're going to be looking at purchase ledger utilities, and within the ledger setup, we're going to start off by looking at the ledger settings. Okay, we have these 5 tabs available to us. Our Options tab gives us the option to use electronic bank payments. By ticking that option on, within our payments groups, we can then select a payment group that's paid by e-banking, and we have the drop-down option of electronic payments, either with remittance paper or remittance email. The actual banking process is set up within the cash book. So within the cash book, you would select the software that you use, and it would generate the file that you can import into that banking software. We also have Allow Batch Processing. By ticking this option on, you have access to another option within Enter Transactions, and we have Batched Transactions and Batched Transactions Manager. This process means that you can enter multiple purchase invoices in any one batch, and it will just check that you've entered the correct number of invoices and the correct value of invoices before they're posted to the purchase accounts. As I say, we'll be looking at examples of all these during the course of the session, the next half an hour. Third option, do we want to automatically generate supplier numbers? We've got that switched off, and as you can see, my supplier numbers are actually made up of an alphanumeric code, which I manually type in. If we were to tick that on, you can select the number you want to start the automation with. So if you're starting at number 1, every time you create a new account, it will increment that by 1 every time you create a new account. So go to 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't mix and match letters and numbers if you have automatically generated supplier numbers switched on. It's purely a numeric code. Allow additional transaction analysis. This is for use within the nominal ledger. For every time you enter a transaction, whether it comes from the purchase ledger or the nominal ledger, sales ledger, if it's switched on there, it will prompt you for a further transaction analysis. And then you can report on those transactions within the nominal based on that analysis code. It tends to be used perhaps for a very simple project management or job costing option, or a marketing option. So your transaction analysis could be a list of marketing campaigns. You assign each of your transactions to a campaign, and then you can report on the transactions relating to that particular analysis. Supplier defaults. You can apply a default early settlement discount if you pay within so many days. These are just defaults, so it would be changed on a supplier by supplier basis. So anything you set here is not going to be written to every supplier within your system. So you can say early settlement discount days. So if you pay within 10 days, you're eligible for a 1% discount. When you're doing your payments run, that will automatically pick up any invoices that have a settlement discount assigned to them, regardless of the due date. So it ensures that you're not actually going to miss out on any sort of due discounts. Account history, keep transactions for any number of months. The maximum number of months you can set there is 36 months. After that period of time, transactions can be archived, so long as you have that button switched on. It is a manual process to archive those transactions, and we'll be having a little look at that process in just a moment. When you go into a supplier inquiry, by default, the maximum number of transactions that will be displayed are, in my example, 100, and it's only going to show the outstanding transactions. Again, this is just the default, so when I open a supplier account, I will see those transactions, excuse me, but I can untick within that inquiry the fact that I don't want to just see outstanding transactions, I want to see everything, or maybe I want to see more than 100 transactions, and I can change that on my inquiry screen. Within the payments run, we can specify a maximum payment to be generated. It will be reported separately before you do your payment run. You can actually see any payments that are more than that particular figure, so you can process those manually. We have a default VAT code, so when we create a new supplier account, by default the VAT code will be set to 1, our standard rate, but again it can be changed on a supplier by supplier basis. And our final option is when we create a new account, by default the terms are going to be agreed because I've got that switched on. If that's switched off, then by default the terms will not be agreed, and you can change that on a supplier by supplier basis. But every time you post a transaction to that supplier, you will get a pop-up message to the effect that default terms have not been agreed. Our aging tab, this is where we define the number of periods that we want to age our creditors over. So the usual tends to be over 4 periods, and then you can define the number of days for each of those periods for your aging creditors. The default payment terms can be set as either calendar monthly, start of month, end of month, or from the document date. And you can specify the number of days from either any of those terms. Within our processing tab, we define if we want to use foreign currency revaluation, and we also define if we want to use invoice authorization, and if we do, what amounts exceeding do we want to authorize. That could be set to nothing, in which case every transaction would automatically require authorization, or you can set an amount by which every transaction over that value will go to unauthorized and has to be manually authorized before it can be paid. Finally, we have our payment groups. If you're going to pay all of your accounts by the same payment method, you can just tick this option at the bottom of the screen here and just define one payment method which will apply to all of your suppliers. However, in real life, we tend to pay suppliers by different methods, maybe by direct debit, by cheque, e-banking, credit card, and we have foreign currency payments as well. You can define for each of the payment groups whether you want the account to be updated once you've run your payment run. I can't understand why you wouldn't want to tick this option on, but it is an option. So when you do your payment run, because you've got this ticked on, the payment will be allocated to the invoices and it will update the purchase ledger and both the cash book. If this is unticked, you can do your payment run, so you get your remittance advices. However, none of your suppliers will be updated with that payment, and it will manually need to be entered when you're comfortable with the figures that have been generated. We have this summarised column, so for our electronic payments, we could summarise the transactions on the cash book. So if we're paying 5 separate suppliers £100 each, we would pay by e-banking and each of the supplier accounts would be updated with those £100 transactions. However, on the cash book, we would see just one transaction for £500, which can make it easier for our bank reconciliation. Payment document determines on the kind of remittance advice that we're actually going to be generating the paperwork that goes with the payment. We've got a remittance and checks. So for those who remember, you could have had an A4 sheet of paper with the remittance with the top half of the layout, and your check was a perforated section at the bottom half of the paper. You can have that stationary layout produced through Sage. You could have just a remittance only, so just an A4 piece of paper with the remittance details on there. Check only, so you could feed your checks through your printer and you'll print out the checks automatically to send to your suppliers. We have an electronic payment, so it will generate a BACS file, but it won't generate a remittance advice. Electronic payment remittance, you can't see there, but that's going to say paper in brackets, so that will produce your BACS payment and a paper remittance advice to send to your suppliers. Remittance only, email, so again you would run your payments routine, it would produce the payment and it would produce a remittance advice that can be emailed to your suppliers. And then finally we have the electronic payment remittance, so you would produce a BACS payment and produce a remittance advice that would be emailed through to your suppliers. So there we have our 7 different options of payment documents available to you. The description is just a typed in description, so it's meaningful to you when you're assigning your payment group to your suppliers. Okay, let's have a little look now at some of the other settings available to us. We have here ledger trading periods. It is possible to change the purchase trading period configuration so that it's different to your accounting periods. Please note this has no effect on the nominal postings that are generated from the purchase ledger. It's purely reflected in your trading reports that you can print out from the purchase ledger. So for example, let's have a little look at 2016. Okey-dokes. Now my accounting periods are set to the end of the calendar month, and I have 12 accounting periods within 2016. However, what I've done for my purchase ledger, as I've said, I want to use separate trading periods. So for the last 3 months, I've changed it so that month 11 ends on the 30th of November, month 12 ends on the 2nd of December, and month 13 ends on the 31st of December. Now, if I were to post a transaction dated 31st of December, it's not going to go into month 13 on my nominal ledger. That's going to be posted into month 12 in accordance with my accounting periods. What this is telling me is that for my trading report, I want to see the transactions on a separate trading period basis. Let's have a little look at the report in question. Within the purchase ledger and reports, we have account analysis, and we have there a trading report detailed. I'm just going to say OK to that and run that report, and I can see my turnover, my trading with my suppliers. I have a list of my suppliers, account number and account name, this year to date, last year, and any future transactions. And now I see the last 7 months worth of transactions. I see the last 7 trading months worth of transactions, not accounting period transactions. So last month is February 2017. Month 1 was end of January 2017. There's my month 13, ending the 31st of December. Month 12 ending the 2nd of December, and month 11 ending the 30th of November. So maybe I want to see my supplier transactions on a 4-week by 4-week basis, but I want all my postings to go in accordance with my accounting periods at the end of the calendar month. Okay, next within our utilities, ledger setup, we've had a little look at the ledger settings, and I'm going to come back and show you some of the effects of the changes of those in just a moment. Had a look at our trading periods. You can view your ledger settings, because if anybody is processing any transactions within Sage 200, you can't go into amend ledger settings, just in case you're going to amend something that have an effect on the work that's being processed. So you have a view ledger settings options, so you can actually view the settings. You can set up factor houses. If you pay some of your suppliers via a factor house, within the factor house option, you just set up the factor house details. So I've got 2 factor houses set up here. I've got my Lloyds and my Barclays factor services set up. If I just edit one of those, I can set up the factor house name, enter a reference, address, contact details for that particular factor house, and I can link suppliers to that factor house through this screen. I can also amend an account, or when I'm creating the original account, assign the factor house through that screen as well. So there's 2 ways of linking a factor house to a supplier, either through the factor house or through the amend account details. Now, by using a factor house, all that means is that when we generate a payment to that supplier, the remittance advice will be addressed to the factor house and not to the supplier, but the payment itself will be assigned to the supplier, and it will clear down the invoices that you're paying. So to show that, if I go to my period end routines and my payment processing, now as I say, I'm not actually going to generate payments. We covered that just a few months ago. I'm going to go into generate payments. I'm going to reprint one of my remittances. So I'm going to select my ASA Products Limited, just pop in a reference, and just say OK to that. My remittance advice has been reprinted, and if you notice, although it's for ASA products and it says on the remittance advice the account number and the account name, it's actually going to be posted to Lloyds Factor Services, so my factor company will know who I've paid and how much. Within our utilities, we can also set up messages to print out on remittances. So if I go into remittance messages, you can set up any number of messages. I've got a message that's set up there, and if I just edit that, I can see that the description is the bank holiday opening hours, and the actual message lines read, please note that our opening hours over the bank holiday weekend will be 9 AM to 1 PM. You have 4 lines of message available to you. Okay, if I close that. So now if I just go back in to my payment process, and again I'm just going to reprint that remittance advice, for that supplier. But this time I select messages and I select which message I would like to be printed on my remittance advice. I say OK to that. So now when I reprint my remittance advice, we can see that at the bottom of the report we have that message that we selected. Okay, that's just pure, it's at the bottom of the report because that's where I've placed it on this particular stationery layout. It can be positioned wherever you choose on your remittance advice. Okay, now finally within our utilities and our ledger setup, we have maintain analysis codes. Analysis codes are originally set up within Accounting System Manager and within Settings, and we have maintain analysis codes. So you can set up a whole library of available analysis codes, but also a drop-down list of values. Now this is a generic list of analysis codes. This is not specific to the purchase ledger, the sales ledger, the nominal. This is purely a library of analysis codes that are available within those modules. Within each module then, so within our purchase ledger, we go to maintain analysis codes, and we select from that drop-down list of available codes what's applicable to our suppliers. We've set up these 5 different analysis codes for our suppliers. We've got a discount band, a purchase manager, a region, a subtype and a trader type. It is possible to make analysis codes mandatory, but you do have to have defined a default analysis codes in order to make that selection. If I now go into any of my accounts, go to my trading tab, here we have our analysis codes, and we can select from the drop-down list that we created previously in our Accounting System Manager the value associated with that analysis code for this particular supplier. You can then run any of your reports based on those analysis codes. So if I go back up to my purchase ledger reports, this time I'll run my creditors report, and I can say I want to run my creditors report for a specific purchase manager. So I can then hand this out to the relevant purchase managers for their accounts, and they can see the value of their creditors. Now I don't know if you noticed, but as I say, there were a number of analysis codes available to you, but by default we only have 3 analysis codes available to us for reporting on our purchase ledger, creditors report, or any other report for that matter. If I say OK to that, if you want to add any of the other analysis codes, you need to just add that criteria to the report. It's a very simple process. So within the report designer, I just load that up for you. Oops. Okay, I'll run that again. Don't know why that didn't work. OK to that, and edit. Okay, dokes. I'm going to try another report because I ran this earlier and it was fine. I'm actually going to do my unauthorized transactions report, see if that one allows me to go into. So you can see here we've got our 3 analysis codes. So I'm say OK to that. I'm just going to edit this. And no, apologies, I have an issue with my report designer this morning. But within the report designer, you just go to report and then criteria. You just tick that you want to see the unavailable criteria, and it will show you all the analysis codes. You just select that as being available. So it's very simple, so long as you can actually get into the report designer. Okay, so moving on. What else do I want to show you this morning? Okay, right, we mentioned invoice authorization, and we have it set so any invoice that's entered that's greater than £1,500 will require authorization. So what this means is for any of my accounts, so if I were to select the Everest Corporation, I'm just going to pop an invoice directly onto that account, and I enter the invoice details as normal. So I'm going to enter the invoice date, the due date, which has been calculated based on the terms for that particular supplier, pop in the invoice number, and maybe a second reference. You have these ticks when you enter a reference, and if you tick that, it will check to ensure that no invoice has been entered with the same reference and date on that particular supplier account. What can happen is some people are matching invoices against purchase orders, and then somebody will put that invoice directly onto the supplier account, so it can cause a duplication. But by just putting that little tick box there, you can ensure that doesn't happen. Now, if I put a goods value in here of £100, okay, I have this requires authorization button. By default it's switched on, but I could untick it if I choose to, because it's less than £1,500. If I change this value, however, to £2,000, the requires authorization button is there and it's ticked on, but it's greyed out. I don't have the option to untick that requires authorization process. I'm just going to save that. Just refresh. So now if I go and look at the transactions for that particular account, we'll see my invoice on there for 2,400. It has a query flag against it and it's U for unauthorized. You can manually set query flags within the supplier accounts, but you can't use the letter U. That's a reserved query flag for your unauthorized purchases. While we're in this screen, I also want to show you that you can add memos to individual transactions. So as well as having memos on the supplier account as a whole, by drilling down within the transaction to the memo, we can then add text, requires authorization by Tom. Okay. And now if you notice on that column, the memo column, we have the letter A, which is saying that we have an active memo against that particular transaction. So anybody else coming to have a little look at this particular supplier will see that there's an active memo. They can drill down into the memo and they can see what the text is associated with that transaction. To remove a memo, you have the option to set it as inactive, and that just changes the flag to an I for inactive, or you can choose to delete it completely. Okay, so you've got visibility of unauthorized transactions through the account itself, but also within our reports, you were just seeing just now, we have the unauthorized transactions report, which you can print out either in its entirety or by any of the analysis codes. And okay, and then you can see a list of all unauthorized transactions for a specific account manager, which again can be sent to them for processing. Okay, I want to show you within the purchase ledger just transactions, a couple of options available to you there. First of all, we have the write-off small amounts. I think this is really, really useful for perhaps the end of year and a little bit of housekeeping when there's penny differences on some of the payments and invoices and the transactions that have taken place within Sage. Within Adjust Transactions, we can select Write-off Small Amounts. You can choose to write off transactions from a single account or from all accounts, and you also choose the maximum value that you want to be looking at. So I'm going to say I just want to look at any values less than £1. So all I'm seeing are all those penny transactions and 75p transactions that are sitting around on my accounts. We just define the VAT code for our VAT write-offs, and by default it will pick up our VAT input code, so we shouldn't need to change that. We have here marketing campaign. Now I don't know if you remember when I mentioned the utilities, we're going through the utilities, I mentioned the additional transaction analysis. This is that analysis code that is associated with a transactions and really is only visible within the nominal ledger. So for each transaction you can assign a marketing campaign in my example here, and then we can report on that in the nominal ledger. So I have my list of transactions for all accounts that are a maximum of £1, and I can go through and choose which of those transactions I want to write off. I can also enter the VAT value against those transactions. Okay, But if I'm happy with all the transactions that I select, all I need to do is select the write-off button, and that will generate a reverse transaction to match against those small amounts, and it will clear down my accounts. So I'm not left with those penny differences cluttering up my creditors. I also want to go through these two options as well, which is amend allocations and reverse transactions. We get quite a lot of queries whereby, a payment has been made to a supplier, but maybe a check has got lost in the post, and you need to repay the same invoice. But of course, that invoice has been paid, it's been allocated against the original payment that went through, so you need to go through a little bit of a process to actually clear down that, that transaction. I'm going to have a little look at that invoice that we just generated. Okay, so we have that £2,400 invoice. Now, the first thing we need to do is authorize that transaction. We can't pay a transaction if it's currently unauthorized. And to authorize, we just go into Enter Transactions. We select Authorization. You can authorize single supplier or multiple supplier transactions. I'm just going to select my Everest account. I will see a list of all the transactions that are unauthorized. Okay, and I can sort it by date range if I choose to. I just highlight the transactions I want to authorize and I click the Authorize button. It's at this point that I have access to the nominal analysis, and I can ensure that my nominal code for that expense is accurate. When you first put an unauthorized transaction on, the nominal posting that will be generated is that it will credit my creditors with the value of that transaction. It will debit my input VAT with the value of that transaction, but it will debit my unauthorized purchases accounts with the value of that transaction. It is only at the point that I authorize that transaction that it will journal out of my unauthorized purchases on the balance sheet, and it will put the expense into the relevant expense account on the P&L. So it's at this point I can confirm that the nominal analysis is accurate. Okay, so I've now authorized that transaction. If I now go back to my inquiries, just to show you there is now no query flag against that transaction, so it's available for me to pay. I'm just going to pop a payment onto that account from my main bank account. I'm just going to say it's check number 111. I'm going to clear down the balance on the account because it's that one invoice that I'm paying, and I'm going to allocate that payment against that transaction. So I'm just going to auto allocate, and I'm going to save that payment. Okay, so we've put our invoice on, we've authorized it, we've put the payment on, and we've sent the check out through the door. A week or so later, the supplier says they've never received that. However, if I refresh my screen, according to our system, we have nothing to pay to that particular supplier. What we need to do is actually reverse the transaction, reverse that payment that was made to that supplier. However, because it's fully allocated, I won't have access to that transaction. If I select my Everest account, if you notice, there are no reversible transactions available to me. The first process I need to do is amend allocations. I need to select the account. There's the check that I just paid for my $2,400, and I edit that. I just select the reverse button at the bottom of the screen here, and I want to reverse both the debit and the credit items, and then I save that process. Now when I go into reverse transaction for that account, there's my payment, my check is available to me. I can select reverse, and it's going to produce an exact replica of that transaction, but the reverse transaction. I made a payment for £2,400. This is going to generate a receipt for £2,400, and it's going to allocate that against the payments that I've selected to reverse. The only thing that I can change is the reference or the second reference. So now, if I go back to my transaction inquiry, by default, I can only see the invoice because that's the only outstanding transaction. Remember, in our settings, we said by default, we only want to show outstanding transactions. However, if I untick that, I can now see all the transactions, even those that have been fully allocated. And there I can see my payments and my receipts being processed on this particular supplier account. The balance on the account has gone back up to 2,400, so that invoice is now available for me to pay again and process a further cheque payment for that transaction. Okay. The final thing that I would like to show you, again, it's something that's not run particularly frequently, and hence we find this option within our period end routines. And that is the account maintenance. If you remember, we set that we want to keep transactions for 24 months, and that after that period we want to archive transactions. The archiving process is a manual process. Sage is not automatically going to archive those transactions. We need to manually go into account maintenance to actually select that process. When we go in here, we can see we have all these different options. We want to archive transactions for open item accounts, balance forward accounts, or automatic allocation accounts. There are 3 types of accounts available to you. Everybody that I know just uses open item accounts, and that gives you your standard structure for your supplier accounts, where you view the transactions and you see all the transactions as they've been entered onto that supplier account. You have the option to create an account as balance forward, and this will make your supplier account look a little like your credit card bill. So at the end of the month you have all your transactions and you have a closing balance. When you run your month-end routine, what Sage will do for your balance forward accounts is it will add up all your outstanding transactions and display those as your opening balance, and then you just see the current transactions on that supplier account. Your automatic allocation accounts mean that you can't allocate payments against invoices. When you run your month-end routine, Sage will automatically allocate any outstanding credits against any outstanding debits in a date range sequence. So that's why everybody I know uses open item accounts. It gives you that full control. So we want to archive transactions for those accounts. You select a date that you want to archive to. Now this has last been run up to the end of March 2015. So I want to archive everything up to the end of the 1st of March. So I'm going to do it to the 31st of March 16. Okay. What this is saying, it's not saying that any transaction that's dated up to the end of March is going to be archived. This is saying that Sage is going to look at all our transactions. Any transactions that are 24 months old as of the 31st of March 2016 will be archived. So it's going to take into consideration the number of months that we want to keep transactions for. So in this example, anything that's dated, because I've got that account set to 24 months, anything that's dated up to the 31st of March 2014 will still be displayed on my current account, on my current listing, but anything older than that will be shown on my historical tab. If I say OK to that, it's going to run through all my accounts, as I say, and look at the transaction date and the number of months that I want to keep transactions for, and it's going to move those transactions from my current file to my historical file. It won't take too long. This is demo data. It doesn't have too many entries. Yeah, there we go. So let's have a little look at one of our accounts and go to our transaction inquiry. So what we see here in our current tab are our current transactions less than 24 months old. And in our historical tab, we see the transactions that are over 24 months old, but that are fully allocated. That's another part of the process. If I have a transaction within my current listing that is 10 years old, if it's still outstanding, it will not move to the historical tab until it's fully allocated. Now those transactions will sit in the historical tab forever until I choose to run within the Utilities and File Maintenance the Purge Transactions option. Now this will delete transactions from the historical file. You can delete transactions from a single account or from all accounts. You can enter a date range of transactions that you want to delete. So 10101 to 31st of the 12th, 2010. And it's only once you've entered that date range that the delete key then becomes available. And by selecting that, it will delete them completely from my historical transactions, so from Sage. So I will not have visibility of those transactions any further. But even so, as part of a year-end process, you know, it's worth thinking about sort of archiving and purging transactions. Okay, so that's it with regard to our purchase ledger. As I say, I've tried to focus on the areas of the module that are not used very frequently to give you a feel of what else is available and what may be useful to you. So we've had a little look at the ledger settings. We've looked at trading periods, factor houses, remittance messages and analysis codes. We've processed invoice authorization, we've reprinted remittances and seen the effect on the remittance advice for the messages and your factor houses. We've also run the trading report to highlight where the trading periods differ to your accounting periods. We've had a little look at period end routines, so archiving transactions and purging transactions, also writing off small amounts. And then finally, we've also had a little look at allocating and reversing transactions for any amendments that are required to payments or invoices. So I hope that's been of benefit. Next month, we'll be looking at the nominal ledger, and again, what we're going to be looking at are all the settings and the parameters associated with that module to see other functionality available to you within the nominal ledger. So I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, I'll get back to you straight away. If you'd like to download the handout, that's available to you, and hopefully we'll see you again next month.